so much. Good evening, everybody. I am so honored to be here with you tonight at the Irving Arts Center to represent the Smithsonian Institution and our traveling exhibition service, Smithsonian affiliations. We are so excited to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country. This is sort of a big milestone on that process for us tonight. I'm so thrilled too that so many of our board members and staff are here. What a fun thing to be able to celebrate and be here with all of you together. We are the national outreach arm of the Smithsonian, so our job is to work really closely with communities across the country to activate Smithsonian stories and Smithsonian people and objects, and supplement that national context that we're able to provide with the local stories and examples and relevance that you are able to provide. It's really that partnership that makes our work work. We know not everybody can come to Washington, so our job is to meet audiences right where you are through a network of more than 200 affiliate museums, through exhibitions that we take on the road, and through our collaborations with state partners that let us bring small exhibitions into rural communities. Last year, we reached more than 30 million people all told. That doubles the traffic on the National Mall. So we think about all of those museums on the mall in Washington and the many, many people coming through. Well, you all are helping us really extend the reach of that program. We have exhibitions, educational programs. We reach about 40 states every year and 150 communities. So we really are in a hometown near you. Like tonight, we're in your hometown. The City of Irving Department of Arts and Culture is a prominent part of that network. As Eric was describing, we have more than 200 affiliates that are in 48 states. We have a little work left to do, and Panama and Puerto Rico. The museums and education centers across the country really collaborate with the Smithsonian to inspire, I got you started too early, to inspire a deeper understanding of our world. We actually have 13 affiliate museums, in Texas, including the Irving Arts Center, which has been an affiliate since 2007, so we have a long history and proud collaboration with your team. I just want to express my appreciation for the team here, for Todd, Eric Hawkins, our executive director, Jennifer Landry, director of museums, and Claire Hullfish. Where's Claire? Hi in the back, Claire, manager of education and programs, and all of your colleagues. You have been incredible hosts to us on this visit and just incredible partners. So one exciting example of the work that we do with our affiliate network, our affiliate community, is this lecture, which is part of our Making History, Making Change series. It's sort of a signature speaker series where we're working with 25 Smithsonian scholars to head out to 25 of our affiliates across the country as part of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This milestone gives us this chance not just to mark a date, but to really reflect on the very full and complex history of our country. Each of our lectures features a Smithsonian expert who shares the story of that richness and complexity of the American experience from their particular lens. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to Vaishali Chadha, to Doug Dreyer, Dr. Ken Kim, and Michael Vu, members of our site's affiliations board. All of you are here tonight. And you're all donors to this Making History, Making Change lecture series. Vaishali and Doug and Ken and Michael, thank you so much to you and your families. Really, this is so meaningful for your generosity, your passion, and making sure that, I'm messing with the mic, is really at the forefront of marking the 250th year. So tonight we are super proud to join the Irving Arts Center and the Irving Archives and Museum in welcoming Dr. Margaret Weitekamp, Chair of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum's Department of Space History. Does that sound like the coolest job you've ever heard of? I know, and the timing of tonight's program, which we planned meticulously, could not have been better suited to, also celebrate the recent return of the Artemis II crew. I don't know if all of you sat watching those 6 minutes of blackness before the capsule fell into the ocean, but what an amazing and special moment that we've had just this week. So to really recognize that. Margaret, who is also working with our team on a special traveling exhibition about women in space, will be back. We'll explore how the Smithsonian preserves cultural memory of spaceflight, specifically the human story of invention and ambition and imagination. Margaret curates the museum's social and cultural history of the spaceflight collection, more than 5,000 artifacts that include space memorabilia and space science fiction. You get the full gamut. She's an author, and her books include Space Craze, America's Enduring Fascination with Real and Imagined Spaceflight, and Right Stuff, Wrong Sex, America's First Women in the Space Program. So Margaret, we are just deeply appreciative that you've made the trip with us to be part of Making History, Making Change, and we thank you for sharing your stories with us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I understand that I'm double mic'd. Can everybody hear me in the back? There we go. Thank you. All right. This is a great time to be able to give this talk because just last week when Artemis II, which you see here on the bottom right, lifted off, it carried with it this, not to scale, this is a 1-inch piece of the fabric from the Wright Flyer from that December 17th, 1903 flight. It is a part of the collection of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. And through the cooperation with NASA, those two moments of invention and innovation have now been linked through this tiny artifact that is a part of the national collection. Now, the background on this is that in 1980, a Wright family representative gave a large piece from the bottom right wing of the 1903 flyer to the museum. And so this small piece, this 1-inch piece that NASA made us weigh in order to include it in the official flight kit, went then on board when Artemis II launched. It returned last Friday, and we are looking forward to putting it on display this year as a part of the 250th and that birthday that we're celebrating. So as has been noted, tonight's talk is a part of that year-long celebration for the 250th of the United States, and I'm excited that I'm able to be here today, and I think it says great things about the Irving Arts Center that they are one of the sites for this national celebration. It's a real distinction and says good things about the staff here, and I can say good things about the staff here as well for how well this appearance has been supported. So I'm delighted to be here tonight to talk about the many intersections of innovation, invention, and memory that underlie the nation's work of remembering our space program. And honestly, this is a special time to be doing this kind of work because 2026 also marks the 50th anniversary of the National Air and Space Museum's building on the National Mall. Has anyone been? Oh, there we go. All right, this is going to be easy. So this is the museum's flagship building on the National Mall as it looked when it opened in 1976. That was part of the bicentennial events that year. This building was the nation's birthday present to itself. So as President Ford called it, from the people to the people, building a National Air and Space Museum building on the mall. And so the National Air and Space Museum's contribution to the 250th is the completion of a complete renovation of this building. We started in 2018. We're going to be done by the end of this year. And the process really required us to re-examine the collection and rethink all of the exhibits. So for my talk tonight, I'm inspired by that renovation and also by this recent Artemis II mission and the return of human beings to the moon. I thought that what I would do would be take you through the nation's collection of artifacts, especially around the Apollo program, those human missions to the moon in the late 1960s and early 1970s. From spacecraft to memorabilia, and re-examine how it was that that collection of artifacts was put together. Because I would argue that there are patterns in how those Apollo artifacts were accessioned into the Smithsonian Institution's National Collection. And those patterns tell us a lot about how our thinking and understanding of the Apollo program has evolved over time, from testimony to commemoration, and finally to symbolism and that larger context. I wanted to talk to you at the end here about the ways that we at the museum are working on bringing this work up to the present, including the recent Artemis II launch. So, as was said, I am the curator for what we call the Social and Cultural History of Spaceflight collection. I thought I would give you a little bit of an example of some of the things that are in that. So it can be one-of-a-kind objects like this medallion, small gold set with precious stones. It was created by a jeweler in commemoration and celebration of John Glenn's flight as the first American to orbit the Earth in February of 1962. One presented to Mrs. Annie Glenn, one presented to the Smithsonian for the National Collection. So we have things that are rare and one of a kind in this collection. We also have everyday objects, a mission patch. Has anyone in here ever had a mission patch? Got a couple? The kind of thing that if you go to witness a launch, you might get something like that. This is the one from STS 93. And this was Eileen Collins' mission as the first time a woman commanded the space shuttle mission. We also then have models, boxed model kits. Any model builders in the crowd? Couple? All right. We keep these not only for the hobby of modeling and the little plastic pieces on the little plastic trees that you might glue together in sand and then decorate and paint, but also for the box art. Right, so this is an image of John Glenn's flight as the first American to orbit the Earth. We can see the Friendship 7 spacecraft separating there from its Atlas booster. That's not a view any human being ever had. So this is an artist's imagination of that, and that tells us something about how this piece is being remembered, how that piece of history is being given to people literally to put their hands on. And then we have two very different pieces of memorabilia in the middle there on the right-hand side of the Apollo 11 lunar landing. On the left, a commemorative medallion. I like this one in particular because the artist who was creating this bothered to make Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins look like them. It looks like that's what they look like. You sometimes get these with just kind of three heads. Sometimes if they're really fudging, you get three helmets. But this is a particularly nice one that was commemorative of that. And then on the right, we have a lady's handbag in the shape of the Apollo Command and Service Module. Those were presented to the wives of the Apollo astronauts. As I'll talk a bit more about later, Michael Collins, the command module pilot for Apollo 11, becomes the director of the National Air and Space Museum when that building was being built in the 1970s. And he was nice enough to bring his wife, Pats, into work and add it to the National Collection. So then we also have imagination in here, and I've got just a couple of examples, a set of stickers from the Star Wars franchise and a 25th anniversary Star Trek credit card, actually, that was issued. So simply put, the popular culture collection is really a collection of material objects that are how ordinary people interact with spaceflight, how we remember it, how we imagine it. And this is, I think, 3D evidence of the social and cultural contexts that are shaping these technologies that are also at the heart of the collection. So this image is from a different anniversary. In December of 2018, the National Air and Space Museum hosted a kickoff event for the 50th anniversary of the Apollo missions writ large. And this was then a Spirit of Apollo event that was held at the Washington National Cathedral. And this is what's known as the space window. And at the center of this is a moon rock. That was brought back by Apollo 11 and then mounted here. And as it happened for that broadcast event, this is where I ended up sitting, is right below the space window and taking this image. And this, I think, is relevant here because the idea of cathedral building is an important, if a bit imperfect, metaphor for how we collect for the National Collection. So I often think of museum work as a kind of cathedral building. You might be familiar with this metaphor, right? The idea that building a cathedral transcends generations. Those who laid the foundation often don't live to see the spires completed. And I think that when you think about the way that generations of workers are adding to different parts, embellishments, core constructing columns, we get a bit of a metaphor for the way that curators are trying to build a collection. Usually you come in somewhere after the foundation has been laid. Sometimes you get to be part of laying a foundation at a new museum. But this is a transgenerational job where you're bringing things into the National Collection and really thinking about the ways that you're adding to this object library that is what the Smithsonian is, and then that you're going to be handing that off to a next generation. And so the National Air and Space Museum preserves objects so that generations from now, when people want to know the real history of aviation and spaceflight, we should have collected and have as evidence for them the right kinds of pieces that will allow them to understand the technologies and the broader story and that broader history. So I take you through this because I think if you want to understand how the Apollo collection was created, you need to know a little bit about how the National Air and Space Museum was developed. So the National Air and Space Museum started as the National Air Museum in 1946. By 1966, they had added the "and space" to the name, and the initial collection of U.S. human spaceflight vehicles was done when the museum was still housed in this building on the National Mall, which is the Arts and Industries building. And you can see it was not large enough for the launch vehicles to be inside. And at the time, those were recent enough objects that people were comfortable with them being outside. But part of the impetus for that new building on the National Mall was trying to have a big enough space to be able to bring some of these things inside. So honestly, if you look at this history, initially NASA wasn't wild about handing over their objects even to another government agency. But by 1964, it became clear, and NASA, frankly, started to get overwhelmed by the requests for loans. Did they have things? Could it go to this museum? Could it go to that museum? And as a result, then there's an agreement signed between the National Air and Space Museum and NASA in 1967 that starts a kind of formal relationship of being able to move things into the Smithsonian's collections. Flown spacecraft, spacesuits, associated equipment, even space food. And they began to be transferred to the museum in different batches. The idea was really driven by the fact the National Air and Space Museum would have as a primary responsibility a robust loan program. And so today, for instance, the Apollo 7 flown command module is in the Frontiers of Flight Museum here in Dallas over by Love Field, and that's loaned from the National Air and Space Museum. So at the beginning, flown spacecraft, and we see here the Apollo 11 command module Columbia that brought Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins back from the moon in July of 1969. The flown spacecraft were the main focus of collecting. And I want to remind you of just how contemporary this was. So between 1969 and 1972, 24 astronauts orbited the moon, 12 on 6 successful landings, actually walked on the lunar surface doing experiments and leaving behind instrument packages that could be interacted with. The flown spacecraft provided the physical evidence of what had been done. But before the spacecraft arrived at the museum, Columbia went on a year-long 50-state tour between April 1970 and May 1971. And then it came to the National Air and Space Museum. So my point is mainly, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that when the astronautics, and that's what the department was called at the time, when that collection was spacecraft centered. And I'm gonna ask you to indulge me for a second. It's useful. When the museum catalogs objects, each artifact gets assigned an individual number. And that begins with a year. For Columbia, it's 1970. And then following that is a 4-digit identifier. Every object gets numbered. And then anything associated with that object can take on one of the 3, we call them paren numbers or extension numbers. The 000 can be 001, 002 to connect anything, and that creates an individual identifier. If you work in the museum world, you know how important cataloging and tracking of the objects is. This is relevant. So, one, notice that I just said the Columbia traveled until 1971, but it has a 1970 number. The museum's already ready for this object to come in, and NASA begins transferring cameras and lenses, in-flight garments, flight plans, checklists, and they end up with all extension numbers. The core number is all actually the capsule, and everything else is cataloged as a capsule accessory. So just to say that that is the beginnings of the way that things start to come in to the collection, and not necessarily being seen as significant pieces on their own so much as accessories to a flown spacecraft. So, space food sometimes didn't get a number at all. They just didn't think it was worth it. So this is a packet of pineapple fruitcake that was flown on Apollo 11. Shockingly not eaten. The uneaten food comes then eventually to the Smithsonian. It gets added to the collection, but at the time it really wasn't being tracked individually. When we look back at the collection of astronaut equipment, space food, even sometimes rocket engines, the initial acquisitions were large in size, numerous in volume, sometimes full of duplication. And frankly, the museum initially accepted far more objects than they probably should have, but the idea was that it was going to populate the loan program, and so having lots of duplication would allow us to send things from the museum all over the world. And as one of the museum's early souvenir catalogs informed readers, if you see a genuine US spacecraft in a museum anywhere in the world, it is almost certainly from this collection. So as early as 1971, the museum starts to collect objects that illustrate not only how Apollo had been accomplished, but also the beginnings of how Apollo was being remembered. So in 1973, a numismatist, a medal and coin collector named Thomas W. Becker donated 45 artifacts, including 43 medals, 1 coin, and a small commemorative plaque. And this represented production from mints all over the world, celebrating especially the Apollo 11 mission. And so we have 3 here. From the left, it's a Spanish medal from Colegio Barna depicting President Nixon. And on the back, it calls Apollo 11 the greatest conquest of all time. So kind of in that conquistador, putting it into a Spanish cultural frame. In the middle here, we have a British medal by Paul Vincent, you know, kind of very triumphant and apparently very flexible in his suit, presumably Neil Armstrong. And then again, similarly, one to the one I showed earlier, this one is from the Vienna Mint. And so commemorative medals like this fit the curator's interest in featuring fine art in the museum's new building and also to having new ways of showing the commemoration. By 1975, the museum acquired NASA's fine art collection. Beginning in 1962, NASA had actually invited artists, sculptors, painters, people who sketched to come to launch sites and to witness what was being done, and then to sculpt, to sketch, to paint. And so this watercolor by Crystal Jackson illustrates the Apollo Command Module simulator. And as much as this looks tremendously abstracted, that's actually what the object looks like. So in the center here, that kind of bluish little triangle is an Apollo Command Module. And if you're trying to simulate things in the 1960s, before you have the kind of miniaturization of computers that we have now, what they built was all of these kind of boxes that allowed projections and that really allowed them to run a full mission simulation inside this. And so Crystal Jackson took that as her inspiration for this watercolor. John Young, the astronaut, called this the Great Train Wreck, is what he thought this looked like. And in fact, the pieces of this actual simulator, which are in the Smithsonian's collection, just last week arrived in London. We've been in discussion for a long time, and they're going to be reassembled for exhibit at the Museum of Science there. So another part of continuing that lone tradition. So here then, side to side, we have kind of two visions of cathedrals for Apollo in the 1970s. Spaces constructed to commemorate the lunar landing. So on the left, we have the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts. So we have Mike, Neil, and Buzz in the middle. At the ceremony of bringing the rock and for the 5th anniversary of their flight. And then on the right, this is the beginnings of the interior of that building on the National Mall. And the original milestones of flight, which was the central gallery, had the 1903 flyer hanging in the middle with Columbia there. And then on the left is Friendship 7, that's John Glenn's spacecraft. And on the right, you're looking at the heat shield, that circle of Gemini 4, which is the first American spacewalk in 1965. Having that building really was the project of Michael Collins, who was Apollo 11 Command Module pilot and museum director. And he himself contributed dozens of pieces of personal equipment, not only his wife's purse, and other private mementos to enliven the displays. So notably, he included Robbins medallions. And so these are things that the Robbins Company of Attleboro, Massachusetts minted for the astronaut office. You could only get these through the astronaut office. And I think that's kind of interesting because even the astronauts wanted a souvenir of these flights. And so what they did is they took the mission patch design and they created these numbered medallions, including this one shown here from Apollo 7. And they were brought into the museum, but this is another place where it took the museum a little bit of time to catch up with the idea that these deserved cataloging and tracking in their own right as significant objects. It was 10 years after Michael Collins gave them that they finally were added to the collection and given their due. Because frankly, it took a little while after those initial acquisitions of the Apollo program to consider memorabilia as a museum-worthy object. So amongst the first examples of commercially available Apollo memorabilia added to the collection was a set of 33 mission patches that were given in 1982 by Mance Clayton. These are not the beta cloth fireproof emblems that were on the spacesuits. These are the embroidered things that you could have picked up if you were visiting the Cape in the 1960s, or if you might have found them anywhere in the country. And I think, in fact, you can see from a little bit of the loose thread here that this is a commercial piece, not something professionally created. But I like it as a way that it's the kind of object that represents how ordinary people might have been interacting with Apollo 11. I will say that my first major acquisition for the museum was the white vest worn by legendary flight controller Gene Kranz during Apollo 13 in 1970. So you may remember that from 1970, or you may remember that from Ron Howard's 1995 movie, or from Jeff Kluger's book with Jim Lovell about Apollo 13. The successful failure of having a mission that had an explosion on the service module, which meant that they were not going to be able to land on the moon, but instead go in a free return trajectory and then successfully bring those 3 astronauts back to Earth. And that was very much guided by critical decisions made in mission control and led by Gene Kranz, who famously wore white suit vests as a part of his everyday wear with his team, which had, there was 3 flight controllers. He was the most junior. The senior folks picked red and blue as their colors. He's the junior guy. He got white. That became iconic. He had these vests that his wife hand sewed this for him. She was an excellent seamstress, created this for him. And really his signature was these wild, embellished, sequined brocade vests, celebratory landing vests. Well, he never put on a celebratory landing vest for Apollo 13 because they really were working that mission to the very, very end. That one then becomes the famous one. And so we have that in the collection to start to tell that story in multiple ways of mission control. Years later, I was able to bring this into the collection, evidence of how most people experienced Apollo, which was via television. So in 2009, we were offered this piece from the family of Walter Lister. Walter Lister was a producer for CBS News. And one of the things that curators get asked to do when we are offered an object for the collection is go through our catalog. Do we already have it? Right, we're now not trying to collect lots and lots of duplicates. We're trying to make sure that we have unique pieces. And frankly, we already had this model, exactly this model, in the collection. But we know that this is the one that Walter Cronkite was holding on air in the 1960s as he was explaining to America how the lunar lander was going to work. And he saved it from being thrown out. When they were done with broadcasting the missions, he thought his daughter's Girl Scout troop would get a kick out of it and that he might be able to use it to explain. When a curator brings something into the collection, we're asked to write, frankly, a long document. We write about a 5-6 page report. What did it come from? How can we prove what the provenance is? What, are there any conservation issues? Are there any storage issues? Fill out all of these things, make an argument about what it is. So I wrote my whole thing about this piece and I presented it to this committee of the whole at the museum. And my colleague caught me on the way out and he said, I would have accepted a sticky note that said, this was Uncle Walter's. So I love having this on display because I think that it really connects to these many stories that we're starting to expand beyond the flown spacecraft to understand not only mission control, how it was received by people, but also having some physical objects that tell us that story of how it was that people around the world were watching this on television. And so both Kranz's vest and Uncle Walter's LEM model are on display in this new gallery, which is called Destination Moon. This is a permanent exhibit that's now installed at the museum's building on the National Mall. You'll see that it features Columbia in the center, along with examples of many of the objects that I've been showing today. I will note in the front here that we have a nice touchable model of Columbia that works nicely for visitors who perhaps have low vision or are blind. And frankly, everybody likes to touch stuff. What we find is when we try to make things more accessible, lots of people take advantage of the accessibility. Kids love to touch stuff. There are people who are just makers who need to get their hands on things. Those always go really well. And the other thing that we've done with this is at the same time that we were putting this exhibit together, we did a detailed interior and exterior scan of Columbia. And so we have that high-res digital scan, the 3D digital model available on the gallery on a monitor, but it's also online. So we're now really able to bring that object online to anybody who would be interested in it. So this is an object that I think speaks to the symbolic power of Apollo. So Jeff Bezos, who you may know as founder of Amazon.com and Blue Origin, funded an expedition to recover the F-1 engines from Apollo 11's Saturn V launch vehicle. So Saturn V, 363 feet tall, takes off. It's got 5 F-1 engines at the bottom that are powering it enough to be able to put it in orbit with enough force to eventually go to the moon after the translunar injection. In 2012, Bezos funded this and went and found those engines which had fallen into the ocean, and we know from the serial numbers that the 4 pieces of 6 that are on display in Destination Moon are from the launch vehicle from Apollo 11. So I think that it's both a powerful engine and a powerful set of objects, kind of metaphorically, to look at the effort then to actually raise that from the ocean floor, preserve it, and allow us to put it on display. So we're not just the on-site museum. This is an image from our digital walkthrough of the expanded Destination Moon exhibit. So this just allows you to take a look at a wall case that we have in the exhibit that talks about how widely distributed work on Apollo was. We know that in the 1960s, as many as 400,000 people were working in one way or another on the Apollo program. This is a wildly incomplete map that just gives you a couple of touch points of what was being done there, but includes the Personal Passive Radiation Dosimeter by General Dynamics in Fort Worth as our example from the great state of Texas. So I hope that you might at some point be able, if you can't come to the museum and walk through the exhibit, you can go online and it's as if you're walking through with a nice 3D rendering, and you can turn, you can zoom in, you can read the labels, you can see all of the things. And so it's a really important part of our trying to break out of just being within the walls to really continue to bring this out. And we're still really collecting about the ways that this story has a broader cultural context. So just in the last few years, we completed the donation from Dr. Patricia Machos Puente of these dishes, which are from the Starburst pattern, first released in 1953 by Franciscan Ceramics. We don't have them on display yet, but I'm delighted to have them in the collection as part of that larger cultural context of the space age. And also then they were featured in the museum's magazine, Air and Space Quarterly, which is another way that the National Air and Space Museum is really working to exist outside of the Washington, D.C. location. So with the renovated building, we're opening exhibits that bring this story up to the present day, including some spaceflight history that has Texas roots. This is an image of the Futures in Space exhibit. The model that's in the foreground is of Blue Origin's RSS First Step, which launches and lands in West Texas. And that is a suborbital launch vehicle. The actual RSS First Step has been promised to the National Air and Space Museum. I expect it will be much less shiny when we finally get to bring it into the collection, as it has been into space repeatedly on its orbital flights. And so we look forward to having that. They just flew it in January, just a few months ago. Behind that, then, we've got the liquid fuel Merlin engine from SpaceX, as well as a grid fin from the bottom of the Falcon 9. That's that reusable space booster that is with SpaceX. And as you know, SpaceX is headquartered just about due south of here along the Gulf Coast. This is a really transformative technology that has demonstrated in practical terms the reliability of reusable boosters. And if you've seen the film of them landing those on a robotic barge in the ocean, it is some Buck Rogers kind of stuff to be able to pull that off quite so reliably. So let me bring us back to Artemis II for the last couple of minutes of my talk. The museum has been actively involved around this, both in the loan of the piece of Wright fabric that went on the mission, but also in some collecting and some outreach. So I don't know where you were watching your Artemis II coverage, but if you got a chance to watch C-SPAN, my colleague, Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony, was on for 3 hours during the launch on April 1st, and then for 2 hours again during the landing, which happened just this last Friday. She is our curator of the Apollo program, and she was here with host Pedro Echeverria and paired with Jeff Volleson, formerly of NASA and now of Capital Technology University's Astronautical Engineering Department. So we were really happy to do what the Smithsonian does well, really try to provide context and history. And so having Teasel there, being able to tell stories about Apollo 8 or Apollo 13 while we were getting ready for the Artemis mission was really important. And then I was part of a small collecting team that went down to the Cape for the launch. We had reservations and we're ready to go in February. We had reservations and we were ready to go in March. So third time was the charm, as you know. And so we were able to do some social media for the museum. This is us on Instagram, which was also echoed on Facebook and some of our other channels. But we were also starting a project of contemporary collecting, which we have not usually done. So we talked to our colleagues in American history who collected the political conventions. And we have some objects back at the museum and some contacts out, and we are going to be working through how we're going to be bringing some of those objects into the collection to document that experience. So I'll end with my view of the launch. And 2 points. First is perhaps obvious, how much these launches are social and cultural events, are cultural phenomena in their own right, worthy of documenting in the national collection. So we are excited to be able to pair some of the artifacts from the Apollo program that I've been showing you today with some new examples that will come from Artemis II. And in doing so, that really, I think, brings me back to my metaphor of cathedral building. So adding to the national collection and sharing those stories around the nation and around the world is an ongoing process that the Smithsonian has been doing for generations and will continue to do. And I think that's very much the spirit of this Making History, Making Change lecture series. And it's what has allowed me to share these stories with you this evening. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was just fascinating and made my museum heart so happy. Let's see if we can get a mic here.
I think we have time for a few questions.
Yes, we have time for a few questions. And because we are recording,
yes,
we're going to have a wonderful Friday here run. So if you want to raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll grab that one. Yes.
How long was the rocket in space?
How long was the rocket in space for Artemis II? That was a 10-day mission, which was kind of deliberately a little bit slow because they were testing a lot of things. So they started going around the Earth, and then they went out and around the moon. They went farther than any human beings have ever been, and then they came back and splashed down in the ocean. 10 days.
So is the Nutella jar going to be in the museum?
We may not be able to preserve the Nutella jar. I'll have to talk to the conservators about that. But that was a wonderful example of the kind of creativity of how people are bringing into space what they want that would make them happy and comfortable, and who wouldn't like to have a little Nutella on a tortilla.
This was terrific. Thank you very much. Do you have a wish list of artifacts that you would love to add to the collection but have so far eluded your grasp? Thank you.
Great question. Do we have a wish list at the Yes, we do. And as scholars, we then always we overperform on that, right? So we write every 5 years, we revise or rewrite a complete collections rationale. What do we have in the collection? What would we want to get next? For every part of it, military, the spacesuits collection, international space flight. And so we have an active list of things that each curator is interested in, and when we have to write that long proposal, a big part of that is to say, where in the collections rationale can you say that we anticipated having this? Because the trick with museum work is not everything, it's literally curating, right? Like you have to be able to pick some things to say we're gonna dedicate national resources to these in perpetuity. So it has to be these things and not that and not this. Yes, we definitely have a list. Every curator has a list, and we're always trying to anticipate. I have a colleague who a few years ago realized he collects satellites, had not anticipated the boom and the creation of small sats, CubeSats. Hugely interesting to the museum, not in the collections rationale, because 4 years ago when he had been writing it, it wasn't an idea at the time. So it is something that we revisit continually and are always trying to justify the what's in, what's out, why this, not that.
Fantastic talk tonight. Could you talk a little bit about some of the future programming? I know you guys are doing a program on women in space and in partnership with the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. Can you talk a little bit about how you collaborate and how you tell some of these stories and share stories across the museum properties?
I'm really excited about that. So the Women in Space traveling exhibit started with some meetings in 2019 between NASA, the National Air and Space Museum, what at the time was the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative, now the National Museum of American Women's History. And so it's really about thinking about, how would we tell these stories in a way that travel well. The trick with exhibit building is always, starting with all of the possible stories you'd like to tell and then whittling down to what can we actually have a kind of consistent through line on. And I think what's exciting about that is the kind of continued and returning energy of that subject. It's something that people who are interested in the stories like Hidden Figures by Margaret Shetterly, those women computers are interested in this, and then through to the presence of Christina Cook on this mission. And so it just has a through line that kind of writes itself, and we're excited about being able to bring that out to museums around the country.
So I don't know about the Nutella jar, but you've got to have the zero gravity indicator.
Oh!
So during the calls with the ground, Christina kept playing with it and she kept floating it around. And they also floated the microphone back and forth.
Yep.
And during this mission, I think it's probably in the last few years, the lowest gravity. It's on the International Space Station. There's a little tiny bit of atmosphere. They've got microgravity. Here, I think it's pretty close to zero gravity, no atmosphere. And so when they had things in there, the only thing pushing them around was air. Mm-hmm. There's interesting kind of artifacts. I had a friend in back about 5 years after Apollo 13. I was visiting his house in Houston. He worked for MIT Draper Labs during the mission. Yeah. And he was on the team at Apollo 13, the software team. They had to redo the software so they could reload it with their frozen fingers, if you remember, mm-hmm. so they could get it back. And on the wall in his house, he had a plaque that says, "All members of the team signed by President Nixon thanking that team for getting Apollo 13 back. So there's interesting artifacts that have gone to the moon
Yes.
that really show you the power of the people that were involved in doing these, and especially getting those astronauts back alive.
Yes.
They barely came back alive.
Oh, that was very close. Fred Hayes was very sick when they
Yes.
got back. So I'll answer a little bit in comment in reverse order. One is there's often the old saw about, there's more power in your iPhone, your various smartphone than went to the moon, which is true because they kept the computing power on the ground. You don't have to fly it. So they kept they had what they needed, and then there were literally rooms full of people and banks of computers on the ground who were working actively, not only in the planning, but also actively during that mission to bring those gentlemen home safely. So yes, the Draper Labs, MIT, Margaret Hamilton just received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Air and Space Museum a couple of years ago, our Michael Collins Trophy, named after our former director, for her work orchestrating and leading the command module computing and the software. She invented the term software engineering. And then you mentioned zero-G indicators. So this, if you're not familiar with these, it's actually a Russian tradition. It started with the Soyuz, and what they would do would be they would allow one of the cosmonauts to bring something, usually a kind of soft toy, a plushie, or it has been a doll, from usually one of their kids, not something purchased specially, bring it on board the mission, and then it becomes a kind of lighthearted mascot for the mission, but it also has this scientific purpose. When it starts to float, you're in zero-G. And so it is kind of tongue-in-cheek called the zero-G indicator. And so we have some in the collection. I have one flown. The very first American to be allowed to pick the zero-G indicator for a Soyuz flight was a gentleman, a NASA astronaut named Joe Akaba. And Joe is a returned Peace Corps volunteer, and his best friend from that is a guy named Jeff Miller, who works for the Forest Service. So the two of them put their heads together. When Joe was going to get to bring the zero-G indicator, he picked Smokey Bear. And so we have a little beanbaggy Smokey Bear plushie that flew to the International Space Station as the zero-G indicator for, with that mission. And then my colleague, Emily Margolis, has picked up on the fact that the SpaceX and the Dragon spacecraft almost always have a zero-G indicator in them, again, a kind of plushy toy. And there's a gentleman who had done the work. We don't have the flown ones, but he had sourced exact duplicates of every Dragon spacecraft zero-G indicator and presented them was able to donate them to the museum as a collection, as a part of our new Collecting in Contemporary Spaceflight. So you saw then Rise, the little stuffy that was created for NASA as a part of a contest where a child got to design that, and then there was a slot inside that held the drive that has the names of all of the people who sent their names to be included on the mission. So I've seen a lot of online chatter asking for copies of Rise to be sold, and I know that people will be very interested in that. So yes, the zero-G indicator story is one that is alive and well, and we're happy. Smokey Bear has been on display and will go back on display in a gallery called At Home in Space that's about shuttle station and contemporary human spaceflight, and that'll open at the end of October.
And I think the uncrewed Artemis I had a Snoopy.
Yes, and Snoopy has a long, the uncrewed Artemis I had a Snoopy, and Snoopy has a long relationship with the Apollo program. Charles Schultz actually allowed NASA to use the licensed character from Peanuts as a part of a variety of what they called at the time manned spaceflight awareness. So posters that would be in places all over that were supporting the Apollo program, reminding people that people's lives were riding on the quality of your work.
Good evening.
Hi.
I'm curious about the philosophy and process of curating. And so today's trash might be tomorrow's treasure.
Yeah.
And there's obviously a limited supply of things from 1970, and then as they age and deprecate, they disappear. So how do you preserve things preemptively to know anticipatorily that you're going to want them 20 or 30 years from now? How do you handle having collected so many things and now maybe they're actually not that precious, but getting rid of them? How do you handle things like US Air Force, US Space Force, and maybe even the US Navy having a giant fleet of aircraft, consumer drones, and so forth? Thanks.
What we do is every curator is first and foremost a scholar and a publishing researcher and scholar. And so we start our collecting from the scholarship. What do we know about the history of these programs? What do we know from going into the archives at NASA and other places and doing the research so that we know them as well as we can? And then we work within the realm of what's possible for what becomes available. And so that means relationships with NASA, with airlines, with the military services, figuring out where there are objects, entire aircraft, entire spacecraft, spacesuits, down to mission patches and pins that could be available to come into the collection. Keeping and maintaining a collection includes deaccessioning. So we sometimes go through things and decide that seemed like a good idea at the time. And it's not justifiable now. And the same way that I have to justify bringing something in, I have to justify taking something out. We try to, if we're removing something from the collection, we often try to find another home for it. Or likewise, if we're talking about if something becomes available that we can't or wouldn't for a reason take, we will sometimes try to find it another place. So I work with social cultural, so I get mostly over the transom kind of emails from people, individuals, hey, I have this thing, hey, I have that thing. If it's not an appropriate object for the national collection, I will try to make a connection for them to, that might be a great thing for the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, or let me introduce you to a colleague. Silver Snoopy pins in the Charles Schultz Snoopy thing. NASA's highest award for spaceflight workers is a Silver Snoopy pin. It means your work has been recognized by a flight crew as being materially contributing to the success of their mission. And it's awarded in person by those astronauts. So we had someone who came to the museum. They have their husband's Silver Snoopy pin, and we have Silver Snoopy pins in the museum. We don't necessarily need lots and lots of them. But he was from Pittsburgh. And I said, I have got connections at the Heinz History Center, and they have a whole exhibit about Pittsburgh and the space age. And that was a great connection. And they said they don't have a Silver Snoopy pin. They would love to have that. So we try to pass people along. One of the things that the Smithsonian, I think, tries to do, and it's very much exemplified by the affiliates program, is we're not the only game in town. And so we're a part of this network of really highly qualified museums that are eager to build their collections and especially to tell the stories of their localities. And often that's that affiliate connection, the Heinz History Center is an affiliate museum, is a great way to be able to pass people along. Or sometimes it's as simple as, is there a local historical association that might be very interested, in your story from your town of how someone from your locality was a part of this big national, international story. So a lot of the short answer for that is a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of arguing, and a lot of defending of choices.
One more question.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for such a great presentation. This is sort of an incidental question. There's a structure, I think, out near Dulles Airport dedicated to aircraft. What is that, and is it affiliated with the Smithsonian?
Yes, the question is about the structure out by Dulles Airport in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. We have the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, which is our second display facility. It is connected to Dulles Airport by a taxiway, and that allows the museum to bring big things in and out. So the Space Shuttle Discovery was flown in 2012 in April, and then was able to be taken off the 747 and put into the space hangar. It is the place that has a Concorde, it has the Enola Gay, it has an SR-71 spy plane, we've got the flown space shuttle. It is really a place that allows us to have some of our largest objects on display, 3 different levels, both parked, hung, and hung from the rafters. And so much of the museum's collection is a research collection that we draw on for exhibit. So the difference with the Udvar-Hazy Center is it's really a kind of more display storage. You can walk through, you can see everything out there, but it's not the kind of integrated exhibits that tell a story the way that we can do downtown. But it's an important part of, we're actually a 3-site museum because we have storage facilities in Maryland that allow us to have a lot of the collection. But our restoration shop, our conservation lab, our archives, our library are out at the Udvar-Hazy Center. So we are very much a museum where I often get asked as a curator, which one do I work at? And the answer is both. I'm out in both locations, downtown and out in Chantilly on a regular basis. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. I encourage you all. I can't wait to get back to DC to see. I saw the Air and Space Museum for the first time in 1986, dating myself a bit, and got bored with my dad, who was completely obsessed and spent all day there. But we're so grateful for you coming and sharing the wonderful collection and stories with us. You also have the Smithsonian in your backyard here in DFW, so please visit our Irving sites when you can, and of course visit DC. And thank you, Smithsonian team, for bringing this wonderful program to our community, and we look forward to future partnerships, and I hope you all have a great evening.